Good afternoon, everyone. We will get started in just a moment. We'll let the participants join in and then we'll begin this important discussion. Okay, let's go ahead and get started, everyone. Good afternoon. We're thrilled to be presenting a timely webinar entitled Dignity Rights in Asia, Humanitarian Toll of Economic Sanctions. This webinar is sponsored by the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice and the Coalition on Racial and Ethnic Justice. This panel is one of many in a series commemorating Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. The ABA is actively planning additional programming on a variety of issues, so please visit americanbar.org/CRSJ for updates on these additional programs. During today's program, we encourage you to ask questions of our panelists. We ask you to do so through the Q&A, not the chat function. If you do not see the controls for the Q&A, please ensure that your screen is not idle, and you should be able to see the Q&A option that way. We will address questions at the end of the program, and we'll also be sharing a recording of the program to everyone who has registered so that you can share it widely with your networks. And with that, we're very excited to begin our program entitled Dignity Rights in Asia, Humanitarian Toll of Economic Sanctions. We truly have a superstar panel today to talk with us from their various perspectives. We're thrilled to have with us Huwaida Araf, who is the attorney and co-founder of International Solidarity Movement, Sahar Aziz, professor of law and chancellor's social justice scholar at Rutgers Law School, Fatimata Bari, who is an attorney at the Barry Law Center, Hania Jodat Barnes, national coordinator of Lift the Sanctions campaign, Brian Egan, who's a partner at Steptoe Johnson, and Aisha Juman, who's president of Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation. My co-moderator today is Nadia Ahmed, who's a professor of law at Barry University. She's also a council member on the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice and serves as co-chair of the section's Environmental Justice Committee. I am Rula Alouche. I'm an attorney at Grande Law in Cincinnati. I also serve as National Board Chair of the Council on American Islamic Relations and also a council member of the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice, serving on our section's Bully-Proof Committee. And with that introduction, I'm really excited to be able to move us to our discussion today and introduce our first speaker. Fatimata Bari is a practicing attorney with over 18 years of client-focused and result-centered experience. Her over 20 years as a community and civil rights advocate and organizer with a focus on civic engagement and coalition building has helped to strengthen her leadership skills. She earned her law degree from the University of Florida Levin College of Law and her bachelor's in psychology from the Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University. She's the owner of Barry Law Center, practicing immigration and special education law, and also provides consulting and registration services to nonprofits. She immigrated to the US from Sierra Leone at the age of 11, and she's advocated at the federal, state, and local levels for immigration benefits. I'm excited to introduce to you all Fatimata.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me here today. This is an amazing conversation that I think needs to be had probably more than once. So my role here today is just to give you an overview of the of why sanctions are not exactly beneficial for the purpose for which they are indicated. So just to give you a little bit of background. So for as far back as the 1990s, like 97, 98, there's been evidence shown, there's been reports issued stating that having sanctions against some of these nations are not beneficial, and that in fact, 1 in 5 sanctions were actually not really, probably more successful, just 1 in 5. So, and that unilateral sanctions, which is what we do a lot here in the US, are not beneficial, and in fact can be very harmful to the countries and to companies and organizations here in the US. And these reports have been put out by the Brookings Institute, by the Peterson Institute for International Economics back in 1997. So then the question is, if the 90s known these things don't work, why do we do it? Why do we continue to put forth these sanctions and continue to sort of almost harm these nations that we are trying to, I guess, change the behavior of the leaders? At the end of the day, it's not the leaders who are harmed, it's the people. So we know that, in my estimation, sanctions are like a virus, like this pandemic, right? It is indiscriminate, and like what happened with this pandemic has shown, those in power can fly out, get the vaccine, cut the line, and get themselves taken care of. Sanctions affect the people of the country, not the leaders per se, who are, for all intents and purposes, as far as the US is concerned, the batters. So at the end of the day, why do we do it? We do it because it makes it look as if we are doing something to address concerns from different groups, different organizations, from different people. So at the end of the day, the US appears to take proactive steps to stop behaviors that we think are inappropriate. But the unilateral sanctions that we use usually cause a lot of harm, because as a unilateral sanction, other countries are not involved, other international entities are not involved. We make decisions and we say we're going to sanction country A, and that's what we do. But what it does at the end of the day is that it may not be strong enough to even really affect the change, because it's just us. And so the countries that are receiving the sanction, or the victims of the sanction, they can go to a third party to get help. But then it may affect the country if then we with secondary sanctions, which then would say that, well, business A, if you provide any services to this country that we are sanctioning, we will also transfer that to you. And so then we're causing harm to the country like Yemen, right? We're causing harm to this country that already has people who are suffering economically, health. And during this pandemic, we were able to see the direct impact of the sanctions, because it prevented the countries from receiving pharmaceutical help from these pharmaceutical companies because of the fear that they have. And so they're not able to provide the medication, they're not able to provide the services, which then exacerbated the pandemic issue in these particular countries. And if you use the sanctions to try to change behaviors that we perceive as either wrong or inappropriate, but we don't target the sanctions and we have a blanket sanction, sometimes, and many times, what it has also done is continue the behaviors that we think we are trying to prevent. So for example, if you put forth a sanction in a country because you believe that they're mistreating their citizens, but then you cut the citizens off the rest of the world, what happens? The authoritarian government that you're trying to impact becomes stronger, because now the rest of the country is cut off from everyone else. And the only people who has control over them is the government. So then you just made the situation worse than what it was before you came in with your sanctions. And just to give an overview, because the other panelists coming up are going to be more specific on the different sections and the different countries that we have listed. But it makes it easier for us as a country, because it's easier to then come and say, oh, this is what we're doing this to address the issues that you have complained about country A. But what happens is, even though you may be easy to put it in, to take it back is a little more difficult. And by the time you take it back, or you try to take it back, the issues have been so deep-seated that years from when the sanctions are implemented and attempted to be reversed, we see that recovery from those sanctions either is extremely slow or doesn't happen. For example, you have a country where you are not providing health benefits to the nation, like the sanctions that they had against Iran. Those sanctions caused the government to not be able to receive or buy pharmaceutical medication for the people. And what did it do? It caused the virus to spread even more, right? There wasn't any help that it could get because no one wanted to deal with them. And as a result, what did we end up getting? More COVID spread in the country. And who gets hurt? The people who live there, the regular people who have nothing to do with the issues between the government, the two governments. But even if they lift the sanctions, we know that this is not something that goes away in a heartbeat, right? Even here in the US, we have over 600,000 people dead just in the United States. And we know that people who have been infected with the virus have long-standing diseases now that they probably would not have had if not for that. So imagine in a country where you don't have the resources that we have here in the US, and these sanctions are put in place and they're affecting the country, they're affecting the people. So this is what sanctions do. And this is why it has been determined for decades that in fact, it's not a good way of changing behavior. And if they want to do it, they should do it more in a targeted fashion and not in a blanket way that at the end of the day does not really help the country, but harm the nation that they're trying to protect and harm the United States. Because when you can't do trade, the companies and corporations that are here also are impacted because they're not able to make the trade with these nations that they're used to making. And it's not just that it hurts over there, it hurts over here because it affects the income, it affects employment. So when some of us think it's really good that sanctions are being put in place, we have to also keep in mind, if not for caring for other countries, think about how it affects us here. There's a negative impact. And generally speaking, you have to weigh the pros and cons, right? And you have to weigh what the benefits are for sanctions and what the negatives are. And by all intents and purposes, there's more negative than positive when it comes to sanctions, especially the unilateral sanctions, especially the secondary sanctions, because those affect people who have nothing to do with the conflict and have nothing to do with the issues that we purporting to address in initiating the sanctions. So that's just a wide-eye eagle view of sanctions and why they are not appropriate to use today, especially in the countries that we're talking about that are already struggling, where people are already suffering, where people are already in a situation where the government may not be taking care of them well to begin with, and we just make it worse.
So much for laying such an excellent foundation for our discussion. Thank you. It's my honor now to turn to our next panelist, Huwaida, who is a Palestinian American attorney and human rights activist. She has her Juris Doctor from the American University Washington College of Law, where she focused her studies on international human rights and humanitarian law. Ms. Araf co-founded the International Solidarity Movement, a Palestinian-led nonviolent resistance movement, which has twice been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. She's helped build the first accredited clinical legal education program in the Arab world, based at Al-Quds University. She was one of the initiators and organizers of the first delegation of lawyers to enter Gaza following Operation Cast Lead in 2008 and 9, and co-authored the report on their findings. Ms. Araf is currently based in Michigan, where she practices civil rights law and continues to devote much of her time to activism on Palestine and other human rights and social justice issues. She's currently the co-chair of the National Lawyers Guild Palestine Subcommittee and sits on a number of organizational boards. In 2020, she served as a Bernie Sanders delegate to the Democratic National Convention, and we look forward to hearing from her today. Boyda, please join us.
Thanks so much, Rola, and thank you, Fatmata, for laying the foundation for the rest of this discussion. Let me start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from Michigan, which sits on the beautiful ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe people, Council of the Three Fires, or the United Nations of Chippewa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi Native tribes. And I want to also, before I start, thank you to all of the organizers for not only organizing this important panel, but for inviting me to participate. I'm going to speak to you about the situation in Gaza, which does not exactly fit the definition of a territory or an area that's under economic sanctions. And I'll explain why after I give just a brief background for those that might not know the details on Gaza. We've probably seen it in the news over the past few weeks because Israel has been raining missiles down on Gaza. And in an 11-day onslaught, we had over 245 people killed, 66 of them children. And in the mainstream media, we heard a lot about, but Hamas is firing missiles into Israel. This is what was reported on the news. What the news has not told us, and which, in our daily lives, what's not easy to find is facts about the situation and what has been happening in Gaza. So while Israel has been saying that they're engaged in responding and engaged in self-defense, we don't understand that Israel has been the initial aggressor in Gaza in many forms. And I will talk about one of them, which is the complete closure that Israel has placed on Gaza. Now, Gaza is a small strip of land, about 140 miles squared, which is about the size of Metro Detroit, where I'm speaking to you from. In there, you have 2 million people in what's been called one of the most densely populated areas in the world. It is part of larger historic Palestine, but Israel now sits on 78% of historic Palestine. So when we talk about Palestine, most people only refer to the West Bank and Gaza. Israel's policy towards Gaza for the last 15 years has been to completely seal it off from the rest of the world. Now, how does it do that? What Israel has been saying is that, well, we ended the occupation of Gaza in 2005. We pulled our settlements, which are illegal colonies built on occupied land. We pulled those out, and Gaza is no longer occupied. So why, are missiles coming out of Gaza? Israel did pull out, but then it placed its military all along this artificially drawn border and trapped the people inside so that Israel controls all of the borders and entry and exit into Gaza by land, and it controls the airspace and it controls the territorial waters. There's one border with Egypt, but Israel has indirect but substantial control over when that border opens and what is allowed to come through. So anything that gets into Gaza and people want to travel out, it goes through Israel. They have to apply for permission, and this is generally denied. So it's a tremendous amount of control that Israel has. And when you talk about an international law, is an area occupied, you don't look at, well, are there soldiers in there? Are there boots on the ground? You look at the effective control that a state or a foreign power has over a territory. And most legal scholars that have looked at this, the International Committee of the Red Cross has said that Gaza remains occupied and Israel is the occupying power. As the occupying power, Israel has an obligation to the civilians that it occupies for the health and well-being of those civilians. Now, instead of living up to the responsibility that it has to make sure that the civilians have adequate food, access to clean water, the ability to work, the ability to carry out a somewhat normal life, a dignified life, Israel has punished the people of Gaza, and it's imposing. So this is why we call it not economic sanctions. It's not a siege, it's not a blockade. It is a suffocating closure, which is a form of collective punishment. And what has that done to the people that live there, the 2 million residents of Gaza? it has devastated life and economy. The 2 million people that live inside, 70% of them are original refugees. When Israel was created, it created a large number of Palestinian refugees. 750,000 Palestinians were kicked out of their homes. Again, in 1967, another wave of refugees. So 70% of the Palestinians that live in Gaza now are refugees. Add to that now this closure, people not having the chance to go home, which they have an international right to, but now they're being punished by a powerful nuclear power that is supposed to care for their health and well-being, but has actually been instituting policies designed to persecute them. There has been the level of unemployment now as a result of this closure is over 50% in Gaza. The level of food aid dependency, the number of the population, now 80% has become food aid dependent, meaning they really don't know where the next meal is going to come from if it's not from an international aid agency. But Israel also controls what aid agencies are able to bring in and out. When I took that delegation to Gaza in 2009, this was immediately following another massive onslaught, which Israel called Operation Cast Lead. We met with the director of the United Nations there in Gaza, and he recounted to us, among other things, that Israel stopped and turned back one of its trucks because it was carrying shampoo and conditioner, you know, the 2-in-1, because Israel allows shampoo into Gaza, but not conditioner. It's that kind of arbitrary and has nothing to do with security. John Kerry, former Secretary of State John Kerry, famously commented that why isn't Israel letting macaroni into Gaza? It is a policy that's designed to allow in the bare minimum, not to allow people to really live with any form of dignity or even to thrive, but to barely survive. Now, I want to take it back to why this is not just economic sanctions. Economic sanctions is commonly understood as like a group of nations coming together, or even one nation, but agreeing to restrict trade with a certain nation to put pressure on that country. Now, generally, this is done through the UN. Sometimes it's done through unilateral countries decide to impose economic sanctions, but Israel has not been authorized to the United Nations to do that. And it's not a group of countries coming together. It is Israel deciding that Gaza cannot trade with the rest of the world because Israel controls all of the borders. So even if the people of Gaza, let's say, and right now, unfortunately, because of the massive bombing campaigns that Israel has carried out since 2008, this last one that we saw over the past 2 weeks is the fourth major bombing campaign, where not only thousands of civilians killed, but also tens of thousands of homes, schools, businesses, factories destroyed. Now, if the factories could operate, what they're able to import in terms of raw material to produce is controlled by Israel. Then if they produce, what they're able to export is controlled by Israel. And Israel has placed arbitrary and suffocating limits on what is able to come in and out. Because of the fact that the people of Gaza have lost a lot of their ability to work in factories and companies, et cetera, because of this closure, some families turn to or try to live off their farmland. Now, 30% of their farmland in Gaza is located in an area where, even though Israel says it's not occupying Gaza, it has declared a no-go zone. No-go zone, that means if people come within 300 yards to a kilometer of this area, that the Israeli military shoots at them. Access to the sea. About 3,500 families rely on the fishing industry. And although generally countries have up to about 20 nautical miles with that they can fish in, Israel has restricted that for Gazans to somewhere between 3 and 6 nautical miles. And that can change daily or whatever Israel feels like. And so if fishermen go beyond whatever miles Israel has set for that day or that week, they get fired upon. Their boats get damaged. Sometimes they're killed. Other times they are arrested. And not only can these farmers not have access to broader waters in which to fish, they're forced to fish in this confined water, which is contaminated because Israel doesn't allow in materials that the Gazans need to address the sewage system and other infrastructural issues. 110 million liters of partially or completely untreated sewage is being dumped into the Mediterranean Sea every single day. And this is the waters that the Gazan fishers are allowed to fish in. And so this kind of complete control, it's not necessarily economic sanctions. Israel is not authorized to place this kind of economic sanctions on Gaza and prevent the rest of the world from trading. But on top of that, completely sealing it, completely controlling people's lives, and then punishing them on top of it. This is a complete violation of international law, Israel's responsibilities. It is collective punishment. And I would go further to say that this is persecution of an entire people. And to end by, I just want to give you an idea of what it may be, the extent of control and the devastating effects that it has on people's lives that we never hear about. And it's through the story of a little girl named Aisha Lulu. Aisha Lulu hit really close to home because she's about the age of my daughter. And by all reports from family members, a very vibrant, happy girl, until one day she just got sick. And her parents couldn't figure out what was wrong. A few different doctors, and she kept being sent home as having, something or another, but it wasn't proving to be what was wrong with her because she kept getting more sick. Eventually, she was diagnosed with having a brain tumor. Now, she couldn't be treated in Gaza. Another, a devastating impact of Israel's policies on Gaza is that they limit the amount of electricity coming in to just a few hours a day, and therefore even hospitals are forced to run on 4 to 6 hours of electricity per day. They try to run generators. I mean, how can you power incubators? How can you perform surgery with that? Medicines and other equipment that hospitals need are restricted by Israel. And so they could not treat her in Gaza. So she had to get permission to travel to Jerusalem, which is about an hour and a half away, to another Palestinian hospital to have the brain tumor removed. An international organization managed to get her permission from the Israelis to leave to get this surgery. She is 5 years old, but Israel would not give her parents permission to go with her. They applied repeatedly, and Israel denied her parents permission. Her aunts, her uncles applied, they were all denied. Her neighbors applied, they were all denied. So this little girl would have to travel alone. Eventually, a neighbor got permission to go, someone that the little girl did not know very well, but she agreed to accompany Aisha. And the little girl left her parents in tears, scared, but it was something she had to do. The operation was successful, but in her recovery, Aisha was just devastated because she was 5 years old. She wanted her mom and dad. And the doctor called her parents to say, do whatever you can to get here because the situation of your daughter is deteriorating, even though the operation was successful. And her parents were not able to. Aisha stopped talking, and one day, just a couple of weeks after her surgery, closed her eyes in tears for the last time, and she died. And so that is just the epitome of the lack of control that a person living in Gaza has over their life. And this is aside from the bombing and being buried under the rubble of your home, try to find what to eat on a certain day, what Israel has let in or what has let out. It is the right to be able to provide your children with some measure of comfort, and security is stripped from them. This is beyond economic sanctions, it's persecution, and I firmly believe, and this is why I also thank the organizers for giving me a chance to tell you a little bit about Gaza here, even though it doesn't fit necessarily into the legal definition of economic sanctions, because it is a policy that I believe the whole world needs to unite against to end it. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Huwaida. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and perspective, and also humanizing what we're hearing about so much on the news these days. Thank you. We'll now turn the discussion to learning a little bit more about the impact on sanctions in Yemen. I'm happy to introduce to you Dr. Aisha Juman, who has over 30 years of experience in public health. She currently is working as an independent consultant coordinating health-related projects in Yemen. She was with the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention from 1995 to 2008. While at the CDC, she had a number of roles, and she also has previously served as the assistant professor at the Rollins School of Public Health at a Department of Epidemiology at Emory University. I apologize. Dr. Juman also worked in her native home, Yemen, with UNFPA and UNDP. She also participated in health-related program development, evaluation, and training activities for Peace Corps. She has her BA from Mills College in Oakland, California, earned her master's in public health from Emory University, and her PhD in epidemiology from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And we look forward to hearing from you, Dr. Juman.
Thank you very much. I have a very tough act to follow. I'm sorry about what's happening in Gaza. It's just heartbreaking. I'll be talking about the impact of the blockade on the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. And this is a picture of a child who is suffering from severe malnutrition in one of the areas that we serve in Yemen. I always like to start my presentation to show people the city where I grew up. This is Sana'a City. It's a World Heritage Site, and it's the longest continuously inhabited city in the world. A lot of people get to hear about Yemen, it's all negative. So I just want to show you that Yemen is actually a beautiful country with a very long history and beautiful culture. I want to start about the blockade that the Saudi imposed on Yemen with US support, with Mahanaji, who is a Yemeni humanitarian worker, what she wrote in her notes about this. She said, in addition, of course, to the airstrikes that had been happening on a daily basis on the Yemeni people since March 2015, a siege was imposed on all the country and the airport was closed. The sky is the property of Saudi Arabia and other countries of led coalition. We are prisoners in our homes. It's not allowed, we're not allowed to move out for getting the approval of Saudi, and most probably our requests will be rejected. I, as a Yemeni American, when I need to go to Yemen, I have to submit my name to the Saudi-led coalition to get permission to go to see my home country and my parents. She goes on to say, after the siege, most of the company closed, and this is the economic impact, and thousands of employees became jobless. So what has happened with the blockade on Yemen? In addition, of course, to the daily airstrikes, we have 20.7 million people who are in need of humanitarian assistance. That's out of 30 million people in Yemen. We have 4 million people who are displaced because of bombing. And we also have 12.1 million people who are in acute need of help. If we look at, in terms of food insecurity in Yemen, this is for this year, we have 16.2 million people, which is over 50% of the population, who are facing high acute food insecurity, which is IPC 3 and above. That means these people who will not, if they don't get the food that they need, the majority of them, or about 25% of them, will actually die of hunger. And as you can see from phase 1 to phase 5, all of Yemen right now is experiencing food insecurity. This is from the UN Chief Mark Lowcock. This was in February 18 when he was addressing the UN Security Council. He said, Yemen is speeding towards the worst famine the world had seen in decades. 16 million people in Yemen were going hungry, and 5 million of those people are just one step away from famine. 400,000 Yemeni children under the age of 5 are severely malnourished. Those children are in their last week and month. They are starving to death. So if he said that in February, I'm assuming that many of the 400,000 children have already died as well. This is from the Telegraph, and this is, and it is quoting the WFP chief. He said, one child dying every 75 seconds as Yemen on the brink of biggest famine in history. A massive famine is creeping into Yemen. We need to stop its devouring a generation. And this is again, Mark Lowcock. The problem with famine and with malnutrition, it's not just that it's killing people now, it's actually impacting a whole generation because their development, not just the physical, but also the mental development is affected. So Yemeni will have to deal with this for many years to come. And people actually resorted to eating tree leaves, as we've seen in our work in Yemen as well. This is Lisa Grande's testimony at the Senate in April of this year. She was a former humanitarian coordinator in Yemen. She basically said in her testimony, and these are actually quotes, I just modified them to make them shorter. It says, coercive measures by the Saudi directed at destroying the economy by the Saudi-led coalition. They controlled the number and timing of all ships entering Hodeidah port. They stopped payments of salaries for public servants in area under Ansarullah. They restrict on lines of credit, quotes on importation of basic goods, including fuel and cooking gas. They import restrictions on industrial material. Measures are main drivers. These measures are the main drivers of the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. They ruin the economic and financial enterprise and starve public and national institutions of necessary resources. At least 130,000 people in Yemen have died because of this. This is again David Beasley, the chief of the World Food Program. What he's saying here is Yemen are starving, not basically for food, for fuel, for medical supplies, and for hope. So it's not just fuel or food that's not allowed in Yemen, medical supplies as well. Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation had a donation of leukemia medicine for every single leukemia case in Yemen for a year. We have not been able to get it to Yemen, although we've been trying for over a year. How did that affect the economy? This is the GDP, cumulative contraction in the GDP. It went from 10.6% in 2014 to minus 46% in 2019, and it is worse by 2020. So it's not just the importation, but also the export out of Yemen. So if we look at the green line is what Yemen used to export, the blue line is what Yemen imports, and then the total foreign trade in blue, and then we have the deficit. And as we can see, we are now at 32.7 deficit by 2019. Famine has arrived in pockets of Yemen. Saudi ships blocking fuel aren't helping. This is a report that was done by Na'man al-Baqir and CNN, and it is her work that actually made the US admit that there is a blockade, although initially they rejected this and they said there was no blockade on Yemen, although we all know the blockade had existed since 2015. This is from a UN commercial imports, and they do tracking to what goes into Yemen, especially Hodeidah and Salif, which are the largest port in Yemen. And the blue lines are food that are allowed in Yemen. And this here, the colored line is what Yemen needs. And the blue lines here are what is allowed in Yemen. And the red lines are the fuel that's allowed in Yemen. This is from July 2016. And the red line on the top here is what Yemen needs per month. And as you can see, although there are some months where more food gets in than what Yemen needs. The majority of the month since 2016, Yemen does not get what it needs. But if we look at fuel, that most of the months, Yemen never got what it needs. And if we look from June of last year until now, Yemen got very little of what it needs. And in February of this year, they got zero into the country of fuel. And we all know that fuel are important for everything in the country. This is again from the UN commodity tracker. And we see this is the fuel import, and this is diesel prices in Yemen this year. And we can see that the prices of fuel have gotten up to 318% compared to what they were before the Saudi-led intervention and war on Yemen. This is the detained fuel vessels off the coast of Jazan in Saudi Arabia up to May of this year. So they were initially 8 ships waiting to get into Yemen, and this is after they get a UN inspection and they are clear to go into Yemen. So this is the holding period from 170 days to 23 days. There were 3 other ships that been there for over a year, and they gave up and eventually left to other destinations. And you can see also that all the ships are actually initially originated in the UAE, which is part of the Saudi-led coalition. So it's really curious. Why would they block ships that they know have no weapons on them because they originated in a coalition-led country? So the impact of the fuel shortages in Yemen, this is again from the UN report. They say basically in North Yemen, crippling fuel shortages since June of 2020, population struggling to access essential services, impacting aid groups' ability to deliver humanitarian assistance. Of course, we have seen increase in food and water prices. We have seen an exacerbation of humanitarian needs, a threat to undercut availability of clean water as fuel powered pumps are out. And we also have seen an increase in waterborne diseases, including cholera and dengue. And the price of water actually has increased, water trucking, by over 300% because we buy water and deliver it to places where they don't have water. Of course, it also impacted COVID-19. Yemen has the largest fatality rate, or the highest fatality rate of COVID-19 in the world at 25% of those cases. And of course, also the oxygen factories are no longer able to run. This is from the US. It says, US urges easing Saudi restrictions on Yemen, Hodeida's port and Sana'a airport. Sana'a airport is closed, which means also people who need medical evacuations are not able to get out. There've been over 35,000 people who needed medical evacuation. Many of them died in Yemen because they're not able to leave Yemen. So although the US keeps saying that they're urging Saudi to ease restriction, the US government actually has a lot of control over this because they sell arms to Saudi Arabia and they help them in their war on Yemen. So they have a strong incentive if they want to end this, because they can tell the Saudis, we're not going to sell more weapons to you and we cannot support you on the war in Yemen if they intended to end what they call restriction, which is a blockade on Yemen. I always ask people who listen to any of presentations that I do that we do need to end the blockade on Yemen, and I would call on you to please call on your elected officials to end the blockade on Yemen and open all points of entry. We need to support a just and inclusive peace in Yemen, and of course, increase humanitarian aid to Yemen and pressure the Saudi, especially in the UAE, to pay their fair share. Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Hania Jodat Barnes, who is a California Democratic Party Assembly District Delegate. She is also the National Coordinator of Lift the Sanctions campaign with Progressive Democrats of America Middle East Alliances, President and co-founder of Muslim Delegates and Allies, and an activist working on expanding equality and equity for the rights of vulnerable populations domestically and internationally. Hania has brought a combination of skills together to inform her activism. She is a businesswoman, philanthropist, entrepreneur, and published author. She has worked as an award-winning face-to-face fundraising coordinator for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees for USA and Australia, and as one of the founding organizing members of the Women's March Los Angeles from 2017 to 2019, and as a director of the Women's March Los Angeles, where she served on the planning committee for Families Belong Together Los Angeles March for Our Lives, as well as the International Women's Strike. Through coordinated efforts with the national team and Sisters March, the Women's March Los Angeles coordinated the Los Angeles celebration of a day without a woman on March 18th, 2017, International Women's Day. In addition, she helped with partnerships and co-produced the Women's March Los Angeles video, Why I Marched, which was featured in the Los Angeles Weekly. In her time, aside from organizing with the Women's March Los Angeles Foundation, she has placed her focus on voter education and voter registration, and encouraging voters and Americans of all backgrounds to vote. She is also a former board member of the Women's March Los Angeles and Women's March California. Thank you so much, Hania. I'm so pleased to introduce you.
Thank you, Sister Nadia. It's an honor to be here and share the same space with such esteemed women and gentlemen who I'm very honored to be with today. And today I do want to say I am standing in solidarity with people of Palestine and Yemen. And when we talk about systemic oppression, I think it's very important for us to recognize that today marks the anniversary of the brutal killing and suffocating of George Floyd. So we do today also stand shoulder to shoulder with the struggles of Black Lives Matter. I do want to talk about and take this opportunity to highlight some of the concerns around the U.S. president imposing sanctions without any congressional approval. Most of U.S. sanctions have been implemented by the president with a flick of a pen as a step before a war targeting countries that do pose a threat to our national security under the 1976 International Emergency Powers Act, which really allows the president to declare a national emergency and impose sanctions without congressional approval. The authors of IEEPA made it very clear that their intention was to limit and control the use of broad international economic powers granted to the president under the Trading with the Enemy Act. In practice, however, that has failed to meet the expectations. As it currently stands, U.S. economic sanctions violate a number of international laws. The United States' use of these unilateral sanctions violates international treaty obligation and the UN resolution, the Vienna Declaration and Program Act, and several UN Human Rights Council resolutions. So the question then is, what can be done to control and limit the president's power on declaring the sanctions so quickly without the congressional approval oftentimes? And I think that needs to really, what we need to really put the focus on is reforming the IEEPA to limit president's sanction powers in order to be able to effectively reclaim congressional control and oversight of these powers, which allow the president to single-handedly destroy the lives of millions of people around the globe. As it was mentioned earlier today, sanctions only impact and cripple the civic society, in particular women and children of the countries that they're imposed on. And the concern then is that when you're limiting food and medical supplies, you're only really paralyzing the poor and emboldening the governments that don't really care about human rights violations to begin with. How we can really reform IEEPA would be by crafting a more precise definition of what constitutes as unusual, extraordinary threat to the U.S. Foreign policy. And there also must be a broader look at what on assessing or demanding on assessing the humanitarian impacts of sanctions on millions of people. Members of Congress can call for mandatory impact assessments of all current and future sanctions to better determine the impacts of them on human lives. And a number of our allies, progressive allies in Congress, have come up with bills. One was introduced in 2020 by Representative Ilhan Omar, 5879, which was a congressional oversight of Sanction Act, which received a multitude of co-sponsors. And there are a number of bills that are introduced, one by Representative Chuy Garcia, which is a 986 bill, which allows for a robust look at the funding that needs to be allocated to countries to be able to purchase medical supplies and so on and so forth. There also needs to be a broader enforced humanitarian exemption. Although secondary sanctions and unilateral sanctions by law exclude importation of food and medical supplies and the necessities, in practice, that exemption is not sufficient to ensure access to these goods. Because as it was mentioned earlier, unfortunately, countries who want to help send aid to countries that are sanctioned are also fined. And who wants to be fined as a company to be able to send medical supplies to a country like Iran, where I come from, for example? And there also needs to be an advocacy for US compliance with its treaty obligations. I'll spend a quick moment here to talk about and expand on what's happening in Iran. And I'm very fortunate to say that Iran and the US are entering their fifth talks in Vienna about sanctions. And what this looked like for us for the past few years, when the Trump administration pulled out of the JCPOA, even though Iran remained within the guidelines of abiding by the laws of JCPOA, even a year after Trump decided to suddenly pull out, 1,500 sanctions were imposed on the country. And what's really concerning about that is that includes medical supplies during a time of a pandemic that has impacted millions of people globally. And that also includes vaccination and COVID vaccine that should be a human right? And not for negotiation, I would say. And of the 1,500 sanctions, what we know is that 700 of them are being looked at to be lifted. We are hoping that does include some economic sanctions on petroleum, as well as economic sanctions on food and medical supplies. 800 will not be, and they're under more of an investigation by the U.S. government and Department of Treasury, because the National Guard of Iran was placed under a terrorist list by the Trump administration, and the 800 are imposed on our National Guard in Iran. In terms of, again, I would say what we can do as active citizens and grassroots movement is to really put the pressure on our Congress members to co-sponsor some of the bills that I mentioned, the newer ones in particular, and again, reforming what constitutes to be a U.S. sanction is really important. And I think what the past few years have shown is that grassroots activism makes a huge impact. So it's really up to us to take the lead on issues and initiatives and really begin pressuring our Congress members to urge the Biden administration to not only lift the sanctions on medical aid supplies, but to have even a broader look at what sanctions can do and impact, and how they impact economies in places like Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, Central Africa, and so on and so forth. I'll hand it back to you, Nadia, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak on this issue.
Thank you, Hania. I really appreciate your comments, as we do all. Next, I wanted to introduce Brian Egan, who is a distinguished international lawyer who advises on a range of complex legal issues that affect his U.S. and foreign clients. His partners with clients to address He partners with clients to address U.S. and multilateral economic sanctions, export controls, anti-money laundering programs, national security investment reviews, as well as other national security matters, cross-border disputes, international cybersecurity and data privacy matters, and issues of public international law. As a former senior legal official with the White House, the National Security Council, and the Department of State and the Department of Treasury under the Obama administration, he has keen insight into domestic and international legal matters that influence U.S. government national security and foreign policies and programs. Brian's clients benefit from his tremendous understanding of the inner workings of the international regulations of interest. As a legal advisor at the State Department, Brian led the office and was responsible for advising on all legal issues that impact U.S. foreign relations, including the U.S. government's international law portfolio. He counseled the Secretary of State and other U.S. government officials on a wide range of pressing domestic and international legal issues, including foreign sovereign immunities, economic sanctions, and resolutions of investment disputes, treaty negotiation, interpretation, cybersecurity, and cyber hacking. He also oversaw litigation against the U.S. government before the International Court of Justice and other international tribunals. Brian has also held prestigious roles at the White House, providing legal advice on a broad range of domestic and international law matters relating to national and homeland security, as well as interacting extensively with senior counsel at every major government department and agency engaged in national security work, including the Departments of Defense, Justice, Homeland Security, Commerce, and Energy, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Office of U.S. Trade Representative, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and the U.S. Mission to the United Nations. He is also currently a partner at Steptoe & Johnson. Thank you. Brian, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Professor Ahmad. And it's my pleasure and my honor to be with these panelists today as well. It's really a humbling experience to hear some of the stories that are being told today. I'm going to speak from my experience both as a former U.S. government official and as a current lawyer advising clients on sanctions compliance. I think that Fatmata in her comments referred to the fact that there's a desire by the US government and others to have targeted sanctions or smarter sanctions. And that's been a term that's been used for over 20 years now to describe what people think of as an appropriate use of sanctions. I don't think that targeted or smarter sanctions necessarily mean that there's no humanitarian impact from sanctions, unfortunately. And I'd like to talk a little bit about how I see those issues playing out in private practice and when I was in the US government. I think that in general, the US government doesn't intend to create humanitarian consequences with sanctions in general. Sanctions are used as an alternative in many cases to military force as a way to do something or to show you're doing something without using the US military. And there's a very fair debate on whether that's an appropriate use of an economic tool. What does targeted sanctions mean, or smart sanctions? Well, generally it means that instead of imposing economic restrictions on a whole country, that the US government and sometimes the UN Security Council and other countries will impose sanctions on specific individuals or specific companies or specific groups or government agencies. The idea being that the sanctions should be imposed against the very parties that are responsible for the problematic behavior that's resulting in the sanctions. So that's kind of the theory behind targeted sanctions or smart sanctions. And if you read the literature and what the US government says, they will frequently say, we're not trying to have a humanitarian impact by imposing sanctions. In fact, we try not to have a humanitarian impact. And there are literally dozens of licenses and what the Treasury Department refers to as frequently asked questions and other guidance materials that have been published by the US government, sometimes by the State Department, sometimes by Treasury, where the US government tries to make it easier from the government's perspective to avoid having humanitarian consequences when it imposes sanctions in many of the areas that we've talked about today. So if there is a desire to avoid humanitarian consequences, in some cases at least, why is there a failure in this area? And my view, there's a couple of different reasons why there's a failure. One is that the rules around sanctions, the laws, the regulations themselves are very gray in some areas. They're not clear. And the penalties for failing to comply, as many of the speakers have already referenced, are very high. That you can be fined. In some cases, you can be subject to criminal penalties. You can subject reputational consequences if you fail to comply with sanctions. So gray area rules, high costs of compliance, and then there's high costs even if you want to comply, hiring people like me to advise you on compliance. It's not inexpensive, and it's time consuming. So let me drill down a little bit on why, some of the difficulties in compliance. If you're a party who wants to comply with US sanctions and you say, okay, I'll read the Treasury Department's guidance, I want to provide humanitarian relief, what do I need to do? Why is it so hard? Well, one reason that's hard is it's sometimes hard to know whether a particular party that you want to deal with is actually subject to sanctions. Even though there's a list of all of the parties in the world that is published by the US government also says things like, if there's another party not on our list who is 50% or more owned by a party on the list, that party's automatically subject to US sanctions, and you have an obligation to figure that out and to comply. So there are non-obvious issues related to sanctions compliance that make for some challenges. There are also kind of collateral issues like the counterparties to an effort. If you want to deliver pharmaceuticals to a country that's subject to sanctions or involving a group subject to sanctions, you may have to think about not only the party who is purchasing or receiving your goods, but also the shippers involved, the insurance companies involved in the transaction, the financial institutions involved in the transaction, and whether any of those parties are subject to sanctions. And you're expected to do due diligence on those issues if you're dealing in areas that are raising sanctions risks, and that can be very challenging as well. And then there's a third area, which is the beneficiaries themselves in some places, where if the people who are receiving the goods or services themselves are subject to sanctions, and sometimes there can be a risk of a violation in that third area as well. We have one client who is a nonprofit group that provides training on the laws of armed conflict and how they apply in areas of the world where non-state actors are in fights with states. And the training is designed to show things like why, when it's appropriate or not to use weapons in certain areas, interrogation techniques and the like. And the US government says, well, that training itself is a violation of sanctions because you're dealing with groups that are on our lists. Even though the training is laudable and it's intended to have positive humanitarian consequences, you still need to deal with the US government before proceeding. So it can be very costly to comply with sanctions as well. And compliance can involve things like reporting to the US government, interacting with the government in ways that many groups or people just aren't interested in doing. So there's the combination of penalties, gray areas, reputational risks, compliance costs, I think can really contribute to decisions where an entity would say, well, why should we do this? And if you're a member of the board of directors of an entity or the executive management of an entity, you may be thinking about your own responsibilities and vulnerabilities for sanctions compliance. Same if you are a business partner or an investor in an entity that's dealing in an area that's high risk. Is it worth the costs and the potential reputational costs to continue doing business in an area is something that many companies and nonprofit groups ask themselves when they're thinking about continuing to do business in an area of the world that's been subject to sanctions. And this is even though the US government has tried, and I think they're doing a little bit better job, but not a great job of being clear that it does not intend humanitarian consequences in many of the areas where it imposes sanctions. I think one real good example of how the US government has basically acknowledged how hard this is in Yemen recently, where the new Secretary of State, Secretary Blinken, in February rolled back sanctions that had been imposed by the Trump administration in January on the Houthis, where President Trump in January had put the Houthi group on the US sanctions list. In doing so, he had issued all sorts of guidance indicating that this was not intended to have humanitarian consequences, that he expected trade in food and other essential services to continue. And 1 month later, the Secretary of State said, we're going to take them off the list because the humanitarian consequences of this use of sanctions is just too significant. And it was basically a pretty stark acknowledgement, in my view, that to some extent, there's nothing the US government can do to avoid those consequences other than to stop using the sanctions tool in some circumstances. So I associate myself with the comments that have been made about thinking about ways to reform the uses of these tools, either in Congress, putting limits on the president's authorities to use sanctions, or even within the executive branch. I think it's possible, if there is a will, to have clearer guidance and more cut and dry rules that would make it easier for those who are doing good work to understand that they could do so and that their partners could do so without running onto the wrong side of US sanctions laws. So I'll stop my comments there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for your comments. I wanted to just provide a reminder to everyone who's on the webinar right now that if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box that you have on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Next, it's my pleasure and honor to introduce Sahar Aziz, who is a professor of law, a Chancellor's social justice scholar and Middle East and legal studies scholar at Rutgers University Law School. Professor Aziz's scholarship adopts an interdisciplinary approach to examining intersections of national security, race, and civil rights with a focus on the adverse impacts of national security laws and policies on racial, ethnic, and religious minorities in the United States. Her research also investigates the relationship between authoritarianism, terrorism, and the rule of law in Egypt. She is a founding director of the interdisciplinary Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights. She is also a faculty affiliate of the African American Studies Department at Rutgers University, Newark, and a member of Rutgers Newark's Chancellor's Commission on Diversity and Transformation. Professor Aziz is an editor of the Arab Law Quarterly and the International Journal of Middle East Studies. She teaches courses on national security, critical race theory, Islamophobia, evidence, torts, and Middle East law. Prior to joining legal academia, Professor Aziz served as a senior policy advisor for the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, where she worked on law and policy at the intersection of national security and civil liberties. She began her legal career as litigation associate for Wilmer Hale, where she was an associate at the Cohen Milstein Sellers and Toll P. LLP in Washington, D.C., where she litigated Title VII class actions on behalf of plaintiffs. She earned her JD and master's degree in Middle East Studies from the University of Texas, where she was an associate editor of the Texas Law Review. Professor Aziz clerked for the Honorable Andre M. Davis at the U.S. District Court for the District of Maryland. Sahar, it's just an honor to have you here, and so please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's really, it's a delight to be here. It's an honor to be here. My only regret is that we're not in person so we can all meet and connect, but hopefully, inshallah, we can do that next year. One of the disadvantages of going last is much of what one wants to say has already been said, but one advantage is trying to tie it all together. And so you'll have to excuse me if some of what I say is a bit redundant, but I think there are many points that are worth saying more than once and facts that are worth repeating. So I'm going to just share my screen And by now, I've gotten a little bit better at this, thanks to online teaching. All right. So my focus, well, as today, we talk a lot on the Middle East, and so I'm intentionally going to be doing that. And before I start, I just want to put a plug in for the center that I direct, the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, csrr.rutgers.edu. The center intentionally focuses on civil and human rights of Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians in the US, and then how that connects to the international events from their countries of origin, most of which are Muslim majority, although not all, because obviously India is not Muslim majority. We have many Muslim Americans who are of Indian origin. So I do encourage you to use that as a resource. And then finally, I'll just put a little plug in for my book, which talks a little bit about this, but goes broader, which is The Racial Muslim Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. And so why many of these sanctions are not coincidentally targeting Muslim majority countries. We have to ask that question in terms of why are there particular countries that are sanctioned and others are not, when in fact you have countries that can be behaving in the same way, but when you involve geopolitics and you can't disregard the history of colonialism that is essentially European origin and a way in which white supremacy globally was enforced, right, through colonialism. So one question we have when we think about sanctions or examine sanctions is to what extent is sanctions the tool of the new imperialism? And so although we may not have formal colonialism, we still have different forms of hegemony that is from the West, right, imposed on the East. Okay, so I will talk quickly about the politics of sanctions, counterterrorism, and sanctions, and a little bit on the humanitarian impact, which again will be a bit redundant, but I think still worth going over. Okay, so the way in which sanctions have been used as we know them today started at least in World War I, at least in a systematic way, not that there weren't other forms of economic embargoes before then, but the British engaged in a form of sanctions against the Germans, right? And that in fact did contribute to malnutrition and to deaths of civilians, and arguably that is part of the intent of sanctions, at least during an active war. The League of Nations, Article 16, which the League of Nations obviously no longer exists and is the predecessor of the United Nations, but it was pretty explicit in stating that automatic and collective embargo against any nation that started an aggressive war is a legitimate form of response. And then in the United States, and then in 1935, this was when considered kind of the first time that the League of Nations used sanctions. They did impose it on Italy, who was invading Ethiopia, but the Italians still succeeded in their invasion. And then in the United States, we have at least 2 laws that were passed that, and we have the Trading with the Enemy Act, which I just quickly skipped, but that was passed during World War I and targeted Germany, and that is the origins of what we now use, what the government uses more often, which was talked about earlier, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act that was passed in 1977. And then we have the Export Control Act, which certainly relates to sanctions. And then finally, these are the states that the US has sanctioned either very broadly, as in the case of Iran, and less broadly in the case of, say, Turkey, where it might be much more narrow. And Iraq, of course, was prior to the invasion. It was a very broad sanction, as we saw with the devastating humanitarian impact in the 1990s on Iraqis. Okay, so this is the justification, right, by well-intentioned people who say, look, we use sanctions to punish and induce recalcitrant governments to comply with international legal norms. And we actually see this as a means, an alternative that is better than war, which kills civilians and devastates, physically devastates countries and infrastructure. And so that's the common argument for those who support sanctions, who will say it's not that we don't care about civilians and humanitarian interests, it's just that we think this is a least harmful objective or means. Now, I put here, I focused on Iran just because it's been so systematically targeted by the US for sanctions. And it's no secret that it's purely politically driven. We don't have enough time to go into the politics of anti-Iranian sentiment. But even if one were to say, well, there was a time when the Iranian students were holding US personnel at the US Embassy in Tehran hostage, and that certainly warrants some state response, that's more than 40 years later, and we're still treating Iran as an enemy state. But here are the different, so you can kind of go through the list. 1979 is when the US sanctions started as a result of or in response to the hostage crisis. And then in 1984, you have the designation of Iran as a state-sponsored terrorism. In 1992, you get the Iran-Iraq Non-Proliferation Act passed. In 1996, you have the Libya Sanctions Act, which is actually called the Iran Sanctions Act. And then you also have the UN that's been acting, the Security Council, which is as a highly political body that refuses to ever, for example, sanction or punish or even criticize Israel for state acts that are clearly in violation of human rights, and yet, of course, will willingly do so when it comes to Iran or Iraq or other Middle Eastern regimes that Western countries would like to control, either their oil or their land or some other form of political control. So the UN Security Council Resolution 1747 of 2007, the UN Resolution Security Council 1803 of 2008, and then again in 2010, UN Security Council 1929. And all of them just continue to tighten and tighten sanctions on Iraq, or I say broaden them, but really tighten the ability and squeeze the ability of Iran's economy to function, which also has severe humanitarian impacts, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then 2010, you have the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions Accountability and Divestment Act. And then this is when the US is targeting firms, as we heard before from my colleagues, where they're really going after not so much the country, but anybody who does any kind of dealings in the country, even if it's completely apolitical, has absolutely nothing to do with any kind of political action. It's purely economic. They still go after them. In 2012, the European Union bans the imports of Iranian oil. So that's using oil as a weapon, right? Or the refusal to buy their oil. In 2012, you have the Iran Threat Reduction and Syria Human Rights Act. And then in 2015, you have this major breakthrough under Obama, which earned him quite a bit of criticism politically by those who want nothing but to starve and squeeze Iranians until they essentially bend at the knee and accept some form of US hegemony, similar to what's happened in Iraq, although that took a kinetic war. But there was the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JPOA, signed by the US, the UK, France, Russia, China, Germany, Iran, and the promise would be that these sanctions would be lifted, and they began to be lifted more, and then the waivers started to become more, were accepted more. But then in 2018, Trump reversed course on that, and we're not going to talk about Trump, but he reversed course on many things, but that was one of his legacies. And now Biden, the question is, what's Biden going to do? All right, so just looking, I wanted to talk a little bit about the intersection between counterterrorism and sanctions, because oftentimes that's the framing that's used, right? It's war, but it's more specifically in the current era and in the war on terror era, post 2001, but even pre 2001 is counterterrorism. So you have the Anti-Terrorism Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, EDPA, and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. And essentially the way it works is that the Department of Treasury has the authority, their Office for Foreign Asset Control has the authority to designate a group or a person as a specially designated terrorist group or as a specially designated global terrorist group. Pick your executive order. One's under Clinton, one's under Bush. Note the bipartisanship. Right? And that's also a very common theme in terms of state policies that target Muslim majority countries in ways that is disparate than other countries, and also the ways in which Muslim diasporas are treated in the US. Right? So it is a bipartisan issue. As the State Department can also designate an organization as a foreign terrorist organization under the Section 219 of the Immigration and Nationality Act. And effectively, once an organization or an entity or a person is designated, then you trigger many of the penalties for any, not just for those people, but anyone who trades with those people, anyone who does any kind of work with them, even if it's not purely economic. But what's worth noting is the absolute lack of due process in the designation process, which is important because it has such an expansive adverse effect, not just on those who are designated, but anyone, again, who's accused of supporting them in any way. So the assets are immediately frozen. There's no prior notice to the designated entity or person. That entity or person only has 30 days to challenge the decision, and there's no opportunity to review the evidence against that person or the entity. Now, you can go into court and challenge it if you do it within the 30 days, but again, it's very difficult to do when you don't have access to evidence because it's all classified, allegedly. The sanctions are then imposed, and then anyone who supports or provides any kind of support to these designated entities or persons could be then prosecuted for material support to terrorism, which holds up to 15 years in prison. And if you look at the Humanitarian Law Project that went before the Supreme Court, you will see just how problematic the material support laws are, particularly for humanitarian groups, peace building groups, anyone who is actually trying to help civilians and help people suffering from war or suffering from terrorism, that even those organizations could be facing prosecution. And I just put my article at the bottom in case you want to go into depth on this issue. I wrote about it as far back as 2003. Okay, so again, going back to this common theme, well, or the response, sanctions are a more humane alternative to kinetic warfare. If we had to pick between two bad options, it's the least bad option. And I think many of my colleagues today, co-panelists, have shown that it's not humane. There are some very serious laws. It's more like death by 1,000 cuts. And you have lack of access to pharmaceuticals, medical supplies, and healthcare. Sanctions have been shown to increase poverty, they increase inflation, they increase unemployment. And there have been arguments made in the literature that all of that then violates Article 11 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and which is the right to an adequate standard of living and the right to establish a minimum entitlement to food, clothing, housing, and at an adequate level. Now, of course, the United States is not a signatory to that because in this highly capitalistic society, we do not recognize economic, social, and cultural rights. So, and that's something that people are proud of. It's not considered a shame in this country, unfortunately. Now, there is an article that I just want to highlight some of the key points. And again, I recommend that you all take a look at it when you have the time. But it's called The Impact of U.S. Sanctions on Poverty. And they looked at tens of countries, not just countries in the Middle East, who had been subjected to sanctions in some form or for some time. And they found that there was at least a 3.8% point larger poverty gap in sanctioned countries compared to the control group that isn't sanctioned. And they also show that the impact of sanctions increases with the severity of the sanctions. So think again of Iran in that case. It's the impact of sanctions on poverty is larger for multilateral sanctions than for unilateral sanctions. And they're longer lasting as the poverty gap increases over the first 21 years of the sanction regime. So this is all intuitive, but this is an empirical study that supports what many of us are claiming normatively. And then finally, the US Special Representative to Syria said in June 2020, US sanctions have contributed to the collapse of the Syrian pound. In just 1 year, the currency has lost 70% of its value and exchange rates are depreciated. Depreciation hurts every Syrian resident. All imports become more expensive, whether it's bullets, medicine, alike. So again, it's a very complex situation, especially when oftentimes the argument is we're trying to punish these bad regimes. For example, if you are opposed to the Assad regime and you are opposed to their human rights violations against its own people, those sanctions, as this shows, doesn't necessarily, well, I'll talk a little bit about how it actually doesn't punish the regime, it helps the regime, but it most certainly punishes the civilians, so they get a double punishment. Now, the other problem is this over-compliance by banks, this risk averseness by banks and pharmaceutical companies, for example, who are weary of violating US sanctions or limits on Iran's access to funds or medicines or medical equipment. And for example, just one example, the Human Rights Watch, there's a Human Rights Watch report about this that found that a European company refused to sell bandages to Iran, an Iranian company, as a result of sanctions, right, despite the humanitarian exception. Banks refused to authorize humanitarian transactions with Iran after the imposition of sanctions because they don't want to take that risk. And so this is also a problem. Now, one response has been that the government needs to be clearer and needs to be much more explicit in terms of reminding banks and pharmaceuticals and other companies about the humanitarian exception, but that's I don't think that's the ultimate solution, as opposed to not having these types of sanctions in the first place. And medicines that otherwise are exempted from sanctions are also prohibited if found to be going to a terrorist designated group, or if even suspected. So this is a really big problem in Gaza. In Gaza, for example, where you have Hamas that effectively controls, is de facto, or actually de jure, the government of Gaza. It's been designated as a terrorist organization. And as my co-panelists mentioned, it's under a complete blockade, but it's also sanctioned because of its FTO status, or all of Gazans are sanctioned. And it's very difficult to find anything in Gaza that doesn't have some connection to one member, even if they're an inactive member of Hamas. And so if you're that person who wants to provide medical equipment or medicine or school supplies to children, and you're, for example, a US company or a US humanitarian organization, you have to be very concerned that you then might be prosecuted for material support to terrorism. And then in Iran, the case of Iran, but other countries, specifically with medicine, those with rare disease conditions tend to suffer even more extremely. So this is what the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights has stated openly, is there needs to be a distinction between the basic objective of applying political and economic pressure upon a stubborn country to persuade them to conform to international law, and the collateral infliction of suffering upon the most vulnerable groups within the targeted country. And that's why there's a humanitarian exemption. But unfortunately, it's either not applied, not enforced, or too narrow. And again, that statement obviously presumes that one accepts sanctions for the purpose of applying political and economic pressure. And it also doesn't, it implies that that's not politically driven, right, by the interests of particular countries. And those countries, not coincidentally, tend to be Western countries, tend to be wealthier countries, tend to be former colonial countries. So, and then just quickly, Yemen's already been covered, so I won't go too much into this, but there are arguments, here's another common argument, is the sanctions are actually imposed on regimes that are brutal towards their own population. Syria is probably most obvious. Iraq was used in the 90s. And there are people from those countries or allies of the revolutionaries or those who were seeking democracy during the Arab Spring who did support sanctioning the dictatorial authoritarian regimes. They saw it as a peace-building effort to weaken the governments so that the people who were fighting for democracy could have a chance at winning. But unfortunately, what's I mean, this is what I'm putting on the screen here is what my co-panelists already talked about in terms of the humanitarian crisis on civilians, but 112,000 people have already died, and it's probably higher at this point. The infrastructure in Yemen of the roads and hospitals, water, electricity are in ruins. Most of Yemen's 30 million people rely on international aid to survive, which means those humanitarian exemptions are very important. And the fact that Ansar Allah, which is essentially the group that controls Sana'a and also is, for all intents and purposes, the Houthis, when they're designated as foreign terrorist organizations, then anyone who is trying to provide humanitarian aid has a almost impossible job, right? Because shipping, financial services, insurance, telecommunication companies, they all refuse to offer those services because they're afraid of violating the IEPA or supporting or being subject to criminal liability for supporting terrorist organizations. And then here is a book that I would recommend if you want to read more about a critique of sanctions in terms of punishing so-called pariah states. And here are the findings that there's an article that cites the book. So the book is Pariah States and Sanctions in the Middle East, Libya, Iraq, Libya, Sudan, that's 2001. And then there's an article in Middle East Policy that summarizes it. And the findings are showing that you're helping the dictators. You're helping the authoritarian state, whether it's Saddam, whether it's Assad, whether it's the Houthis, if the Houthis are the people that you oppose. And ultimately, the authoritarian regimes consolidate their power as a result of sanctions. They're able to demonize the sanctioning country as a conspiracy against the people. The democratization of the authoritarian state becomes even less likely because the economic climate is so harsh and people are suffering so much. And ultimately, it's not effective for that purpose. So again, I think we just need to do more empirical studies before, or at least read the empirical studies before we conclude that the sanctions are a peace-building mechanism. So finally, I'll just end with this quote, which is by the Commission on Economic, Cultural, and Social Rights, or the UN Committee on it. The inhabitants of a stubborn country do not forfeit their basic economic, social, and cultural rights by virtue of any determination that their leaders have violated norms relating to international peace and security. The aim is to insist that lawlessness of one kind should not be met by lawlessness of another kind, which pays no heed to the fundamental rights that underlie and give legitimacy to any such collective action. And so with that, I thank you, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Sahar. I wanted to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. We're running short on time, so unfortunately we won't have time for Q&A, but we wanted to thank you all for joining this free webinar. We encourage you to check out other webinars for the Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month webinar series. And we also wanted to express our deep gratitude to all of the panelists. You're all doing such critical work, and we really want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be with us. The section of Civil Rights and Social Justice at the American Bar Association provides free webinars and resources for legal professionals and advocates nationwide. We hope this helps you in your work. And again, if you can, please joining and becoming an active member of the ABA. You may also do so at ambar.org/CRSJ. Best of luck in your work.